Welcome, everyone. Today is the second session with Eric Gertner, Learning to Recover. This week, we'll be talking about lost relatives, more specifically children who have been lost and recovered during the aftermath of the Holocaust. I'd like to welcome Eric once again, just to refresh everyone's memory. Eric is a child of Holocaust survivors. He's also a retired lawyer. He was with McCarthy Tetro for 30 years as their research director. He now lectures on the Holocaust and the law, and I would have to say he is now a well-respected scholar on the topic. So welcome, Eric, once more. I just would like to thank actually our Adult Education Committee for sponsoring today's program. And also to remind everyone, if they have questions, please put it in the chat box and direct the questions to me, Gail at Beth Tikva Toronto, and I will read the questions out to Eric at the end of our session. So welcome once again, Eric.
Okay, thank you everybody for deciding to come back to hear the second of these three talks. As Gail said, today I'm going to focus on recovery in the context of reuniting families, and it's going to focus on two events about 75 years apart. And the two events are obviously the end of the Holocaust and the efforts to reunite families after the Holocaust, particularly children with parents, or if parents have passed away, with other relatives who would take care of them. And then the events of the last couple of years under the Trump administration and the implementation and consequences of the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, which resulted, as we now know, in approximately 5,000 or 6,000 children being separated from their parent or parents at the US-Mexico border, with, as I will explain, some dire consequences for all those involved. I want to point out a few things. As you may recall, last week's talk was actually on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and that date is marked as International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the international community, and particularly through the UN. One of the goals of this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is to focus on the 1.5 million children who were killed during the Holocaust, Jewish children, of the 6 million Jews that were killed. But I also think it's important to focus on the children who survived. And there are estimated somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 children who survived the Holocaust, obviously in different places and in different ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I want to assure you that I have no influence on President Biden and his executive order that was issued yesterday, looking into the whole issue of the separation of parents and children under the zero tolerance policy. But you will probably know that he has adopted an executive order creating a task force to look into that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that also towards the end. So there are many things to talk about when we talk about these two issues. I'm going to start by making a few comments about the zero tolerance policy, and then we'll shift over to the Holocaust, and then we'll compare the two events, as I said, that occurred about 70 or 75 years apart. Zero tolerance, as you may know, was a policy introduced in 2017. The secretary or member of the cabinet responsible for the policy was in fact Jeff Sessions, the first Attorney General for Donald Trump. And the policy basically carried on for about a year officially, but it's estimated that it continued even after it was allegedly finished or withdrawn, and carried on for some years. And the consequences of it are still being felt, as we will see as we go on. The policy never really gained a lot of traction among the American public. It was highly criticized by the media. It was highly criticized by members of the public who protested the zero tolerance policy and the impact that that had on families trying to seek asylum at the US southern border. It has obviously been criticized by many NGOs and public lawyers. So in all, it was not a resounding positive policy on the part of the Trump administration. Even worse than that, as we've seen over the last few months, there have been 2 reports issued by the US government evaluating the policy. The first one was issued in December of last year by the Inspector General of Health and Human Services, and was highly critical of the policy that was adopted by the Trump administration. And more recently, last month, the Inspector General for the Department of Justice also issued a report which was particularly critical of the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and his adoption of the policy without actually thinking through the consequences, or even worse than that, knowing what the consequences would be and deliberately going forward with the policy. So it was not definitely a resounding success. And it has garnered a great amount of attention, even from Holocaust survivors who are highly critical of the policy, because obviously it brought back lots of memories, whether you were a child of survivors or whether you were an adult survivor. All of these images of children being torn from their parents' arms and being separated from their parents brought back terrible memories of what happened in the period of 1939 to 1945. And the fact that the Trump administration possibly did not comprehend the consequences to the children in particular, but to the families all told, is almost impossible to comprehend. And I say that because since the end of the war, and ever since the end of the war, there have been lots of articles and lots of books written about the traumatic impact that the Holocaust has had on individuals, but in particular on children. And there's a recent book that's come out by Rebecca Clifford, which is entitled Survivors, Children's Lives After the Holocaust, which goes into a lot of these issues about the trauma suffered by children in particular who were separated from their parents, and in some cases never saw their parents again. One of the organizations that was highly critical of the zero tolerance policy was the American Pediatric Association, which obviously understood the impact that separation from their parents could have on young children and even young adults, teenagers. And if you didn't believe that in the first place, what we've seen over the last maybe decade are lots of studies into the subject called epigenetics, which is a study that looks at the genetic impact of trauma on the subsequent generation. And there have been a number of studies done that indicate that the trauma that my parents, for example, might have suffered as a result of the Holocaust resulted in some genetic changes, which resulted in my genes being different than the genes that they would have had at their birth, and not necessarily in a good way. Now, the use or misuse of children in these kinds of events is nothing new. We should not be terribly shocked that the Trump administration adopted the zero tolerance policy. It's obviously an unconscionable policy to have been adopted, but we've seen children misused and abused throughout certainly the last 100 years in a variety of different circumstances, and certainly longer than that. And I'm just going to read out a list of examples. The whole situation with Indigenous people and children in particular in Canada and the US indicates the trauma that can occur to children who are separated from their parents and from their heritage and from their tradition. We have the use of the impact of civil wars in Chile in the 70s and Argentina in the 1980s, and the impact that that had on children whose parents were killed by these fascist regimes. We have obviously the example of the Third Reich and Jewish children, but it goes further than that. The Third Reich also separated Polish children from their parents if they looked particularly Aryan, and they would be brought into Germany and adopted by German families to help stock the Aryan race. That's just another example. We have the example of the British government earlier in the 20th century with home children who were sent to Canada and Australia in particular, and it's estimated that perhaps 100,000 children were sent to those two jurisdictions in particular, obviously separated from their families. In some cases, they would have been orphans, but they were being torn out of their comfort zone where they had lived and grown up. We have examples of similar things happening in Ireland, where the children of unwed mothers were removed from their mothers, and in some cases adopted by families in the United States or parents in the United States. And one of the best depictions of that is the film Philomena, which maybe you have seen. A very moving and touching example of a mother who was one of these unwed mothers who lost her child, searching for her child, ultimately discovering his name, but ultimately also discovering that by the time she was able to locate him and discover who he was, he had already passed away. We, of course, have the Nazi regime and the murder of 1.5 million children. And as I said, it's estimated that somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 children survived, but in many cases in very dire circumstances. And in all circumstances, they had been deprived of their identity in some way or another, whether they were hidden in convents and other religious organizations, or housed with neighbors and forced to adopt another religion for a period of time to be safe, or even worse, hiding in the woods, joining partisan groups, and obviously losing any kind of childhood that they might have had. Of course, there were children who were protected and saved, and I've just mentioned some of the instances. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we know about these 100,000 to 200,000. And there are various efforts that were made. Probably the most significant, of course, was the Kindertransport, a policy adopted by the British government in the late 1938, adopted by Parliament at the same time that the American government was debating a similar policy with double the number of children, which Congress never adopted. And it was never actually even put to a vote because it was believed it would never pass. So 10,000 kids were given away or given to British families to be protected. They were voluntarily surrendered by their parents at obviously great emotional impact to the parents and the children. But those 10,000 children, most of them survived. It's important to recognize that the older ones ultimately ended up in internment camps for aliens because they were not British. Many of them were ultimately interned with Germans, some of whom were Nazis. We have our own Canadian connection to that because when there were too many of them housed in the camps in the UK, they were sent in some cases to Canada and in some cases to other jurisdictions as well. But that was 10,000 people. You probably also have heard the story of Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton was an English businessman who took it upon himself. He wasn't part of the Kindertransport. He decided to go to Czechoslovakia and save the lives of as many children as he could. And ultimately he saved, it's said to be 669 children. And there are obviously stories of the descendants of those 669. It ends up to be about 5,000 people, ultimately, that Nicholas Winton's efforts with others was able to save. Now, if you go to Yad Vashem, you will not see Nicholas Winton's name among the righteous of the nations. And the reason for that is Nicholas Winton actually has Jewish heritage, and the righteous among the nations is reserved for people who are not Jewish. So Nicholas Winton is not recognized as a righteous among the nations, but he's clearly a very important figure in the efforts to save children during or the pre-Holocaust period. And then, of course, we have the stories of the children who were hidden in convents and other religious institutions with the assistance of the Catholic Church in most cases, in some cases other religions. We have children who were hidden with friends of their parents or complete strangers in some cases. And the children, as I said before, children who ran away and were in the forests and ultimately were either saved by some non-Jewish person or joined the partisan group. So we have this group of children, which is really the focus of my talk, because at the end of the war, what do we do with these children? What happens to these children? The same dilemma that we have with some of the children who were separated at the US-Mexico border, which I'll talk about in a little while. So I want to compare the motivations of the two administrations involved in these two horrible acts. We have Hitler, who obviously undertook the murder of 6 million Jews deliberately, which obviously involved the murder of 1.5 million children. But his policies extended beyond just Jewish children. There were other children who were killed during the war, obviously, not necessarily in the same way that Jewish children were. But there also, of course, was the euthanasia program that was undertaken by the Third Reich, in which children whose, as they said, whose lives were unworthy of life were euthanized, along with many adults who also fell into that category because they were either had mental issues or were physically disabled and could not really add anything to the Third Reich. The Trump administration, the worst policy obviously was this zero tolerance policy, which was, as we now know, a deliberate policy to separate parents and children. But for what purpose? The purpose was twofold. One, it was intended to be cruel. Full stop. And it was intended to be cruel to deter other immigrants from coming to the US southern border to seek asylum. And seeking asylum, of course, is a totally legal act. It's protected by the Refugee Convention adopted in 1951 by the UN, to which the US is a signatory. And it was a convention adopted partly in response to the events of the Holocaust. But Trump administration's actions vis-a-vis children are not limited to the zero tolerance policy, and we need to put that policy into context. The Trump administration adopted all kinds of other policies aimed at harming children. The reduction of the availability of food stamps, efforts to reduce the healthcare available to children in the United States. The whole issue of DACA was really aimed at children who had obviously been brought to the United States as minors and were now in many cases adults and had particular benefits of growing up in the United States. So in both cases, many individuals were affected, many families were affected. And as I said, in each case, there were people who were trying to assist children. I've already gone through those in the case of World War II and Hitler's policies. In the case of the US, and in particular in respect of the zero tolerance policy, we have pro bono lawyers, we have NGOs, we have the media. We may even have had Melania Trump, who obviously went down to the southern border in a very controversial garb, but whether in fact she was there just as a promotion or to help her husband or was actually well-intentioned, we don't know. So what happened after the end of the Second World War, and what happened with respect to zero tolerance in the efforts to bring parents and children back together, or children with other relatives in the case of the Holocaust, when their parents had perished? I need to put the efforts into a context, because the period we live in now is obviously very different in many ways from the period just after World War II. So here's the means that were available to create these connections after World War II. We have to remember there was no internet. There really wasn't any TV. We didn't have DNA tests. Not everybody had telephones, let alone cell phones or mobile phones. So how did these connections, how were these connections created or developed? Well, initially, it happened through word of mouth. People who were returning to their hometown and having survived, or relatives who had survived, or relatives who were in the West or in Australia, New Zealand, and were looking for relatives, they would send out feelers to see who might have survived. But there was obviously a lot of word of mouth just from the survivors themselves. There was a lot of self-help involved, people going around and trying to get information about possible relatives who'd survived. And the other advantage that they had was the fact that the Nazi regime kept meticulous records. So there was a lot of information in the Nazi records, which were ultimately seized by the Allied forces, particularly the United States. And those records would soon be used to help connect families after the war. Now let's look at present day. What do we have? We have the internet. We have DNA. We have phones that are ubiquitous, that even people in the poorest countries will often have cell phones. We have ubiquitous radio and television. And we have, unfortunately, a lack of records kept by the US government. So the fact that we had all these modern technologies to reunite families was hampered significantly by the fact that the American government, by their own admission, kept terrible records about families being separated and which parents were being deported and which parents were not and where the kids were being sent. It was just a big, giant mess. And it's still a mess, as we'll see. So what happens after the Second World War? We have, as I said, all of these things that aren't available. We have some methods of reconnecting that are available, but there are important tools that ultimately come to the fore. The first thing I would say is that there, in many towns, as I learned from a child survivor, there were billboards or boards set up with seeking information about relatives who might have disappeared or weren't available or weren't found or might have been killed. And people would gather around these billboards trying to get information that might help them to find their relatives. And obviously they would meet other people in those places and try to get information from them. And if you can recall what it looked like after 9/11, when there were obviously all these photographs and notices posted outside the site of the Twin Towers, it looked a lot like that, but a lot smaller in a lot of these towns. The same thing happened after the tsunami in Southeast Asia. And you can go and find pictures of that. And the same thing happened after Katrina, where people simply posted notices to try to see if they could locate a relative who had gone missing. So there were these sort of ad hoc methods of trying to get information. But a number of other more sophisticated means were adopted. To give you two examples of two different countries, and basically adopting the same kind of approach. Both the BBC and the radio in Israel, which is now called Kol Yisrael, or there might be other stations, but that was the basic radio station. They would have time set aside where they would just read out the names of children and trying to see if anybody would respond, that they were their parents or that they were a relative, somehow trying to connect these children to other family members. The BBC ran this kind of program for about 5 years after the war. Kol Yisrael ran this program from the early 1950s till 2002, so 50 years. They stopped for a period of time and then restarted, and I think it's still going on today. Now, obviously, the ability to connect with a relative from that period of time is greatly diminished because of the passage of time, but there are still connections being made as a result of these broadcasts. Of course, we have other means today. We can have Jewish genealogy, Ancestry.com, 23andMe, that are available today, but obviously weren't available right after the war. The other main vehicle to find information about relatives in the post-war period was something that eventually became the International Tracing Service, which originally started in a different form. And here's a picture from the archives of the International Tracing Service located in Bad Arolsen in Germany. But it started off as something called the International Information Office, located mainly to deal with prisoners who had been at Dachau. It then was transformed a little bit by the British Red Cross. It then evolved into something called the Central Tracing Service, and then into the International Refugee Organization, and eventually became the ITS, or the International Tracing Service. Now, I will recommend that you go to the website of I assume he's a retired doctor, but who is as a photographer, probably not, I couldn't think I would call him an amateur photographer, but his name is Richard Ehrlich, E-H-R-L-I-C-H, whose photographs I came across by accident and who I've communicated with since then, about a month ago, who was one of the first, if not the first person to go into the archives as a non-worker there, and was able to take photographs of the archives. And the photographs are amazing and incredibly informative, because it describes a number of there are different photographs describing different sections of the archives. There's a section dealing with Auschwitz, a section dealing with Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald. There's a section that deals with children. There's also information, a section that deals with children who survived of the war. So those photographs are amazing. That the archives in Bad Arolsen, just so that you know, were set up pursuant to an agreement between, I believe, 11 countries, allied countries plus Germany. But the opening of the archives to researchers was denied if only one country refused to grant access. And up until the early part of this century, the German government refused to open the archives to researchers, but that's now happened. Richard Ehrlich was able, obviously, to go in as that happened. And those archives are now being digitized and being made available at different sites, like the Shoah Foundation at USC under Steven Spielberg, Yad Vashem, and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. So all of those records are available. Now, it's important to recognize that most of those records are records that were created by the Third Reich. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And to give you an idea of the scope of the archives, there are I'm told, 16 miles of shelving full of documents like the photograph that you saw. So I really recommend that you go to see Richard Ehrlich's site. It's richardehrlichphotography.com, and it's certainly worth a visit. So the ITS became the mainstay for the discovery of connections to relatives. And lots of people have used those archives and the information available to them through those archives. And that's how a lot of people got reconnected either to family, children, or other relatives, or more distant relatives. But of course, there were also totally idiosyncratic connections that came about. And just as an aside, there are still people discovering relatives today, more than 75 years after the war. An article I think that I sent to Gail, and one of the links that she has, is an article about twins who rediscovered each other almost 70 years after the war. But just to give you an example of the idiosyncratic ways that these connections sometimes occurred, my mother had a cousin who was also a survivor, who ultimately came to the States, lived in the United States. He lived in Denver, Colorado. He came from a relatively large family, but as far as he knew, only one of his sisters had survived the war. And obviously he was in communications with that sister. He lived in Denver, she lived in Israel. And about 35 years after the end of the war, some woman comes up to his sister in Israel and says, you know, I just met somebody who looks remarkably like you. And it turned out it was another sister. So those two sisters got together in Israel. Ultimately, my mother's cousin in Denver, Colorado, flew to Israel to meet his long-lost sister. And these are stories that you frequently hear about, and I don't think they're made up. This is a true story. So what about zero tolerance in the Trump administration? Well, as I said, the records are not terribly well maintained. They didn't obtain all the information that they needed. And the result was that for a number of years, there were limited efforts to reunite families, parents with children, despite constant legal efforts to force the Trump administration to do so. And the ACLU and other organizations would frequently be in court. The court would make some kind of order requiring the US government to make their best efforts to do things, but it was more or less a slipshod effort to obtain this information. In fact, it was so bad, and I would suspect deliberate, that it was only at the end of last year that the US government, after being prodded by the courts and by lawyers, said, oh, you know what, we have a whole bunch of phone records of parents who have been deported, and they might be useful to you. And of course they would be useful. But even if those phone records had been passed along earlier, the US government has tremendous power and authority, especially with a lot of these Central American governments, as we saw during the zero tolerance policy. You don't think that they could strong arm some of these governments to help them locate some of these parents who had been deported? Do you not think that they could have used their diplomatic resources to help locate some of these parents and reunite them with their children? I think the fact that the American government failed to act in a clear and deliberate fashion to reunite parents and children only underscores the purpose of their zero tolerance policy, which was deliberately to separate parents and children, because that cruelty would result, hopefully, in the deterrence of other families approaching the border seeking asylum. Now, So that's the story of zero tolerance. We're going to come back to what has happened yesterday with the announcement of this task force. But I want to turn to a connected story, which I only came across, I would say, maybe 6 months ago. And, you know, I do a lot of reading about the Holocaust, but I'd never heard this story. I'd certainly heard about children being hidden in convents and by priests. I've met some of those children in winters down in Palm Springs, and they tell fascinating and amazing stories. But the story I'm going to tell you about is one, as I said, I only came across about 6 months ago. And it is obviously a very famous story about children who survived the Holocaust and were looking to be reunited, and their family was looking to be reunited with them. And it's the story of the Finley brothers. They're two brothers who were very young during the war, like 3 or 4 years old. Their parents are originally from Austria. The parents move with their kids to Grenoble, France, when the Anschluss happens in Austria. And eventually the parents are arrested and deported to Auschwitz, where they die. And that happens late in the war in 1944. Before they are taken off, they have told people, especially one woman, that if they go missing, they want their children to be connected with relatives who either are in New Zealand or in America or in Israel, and they want them to be raised as Jews. And here's a picture of the Finley brothers. So 1945, the war is over. The woman who had been protecting these children for a short period of time hands the children over to a religious woman who ultimately has the boys baptized. They are raised as, for a period of time, as Catholics. And when inquiries are made, because the parents discover, the relatives discover that these boys are alive, there are efforts made to have the boys connected and taken to New Zealand to live with relatives there. And eventually there are also relatives in Israel who are obviously willing to raise these boys. But the woman who has custody of them is refusing to turn them over. And she's refusing to turn them over because they are now baptized and they're now Catholics. They're no longer Jews. And under the edict of the Catholic Church, they are not to be taken away from their new religion and not to be handed over to be raised as Jews. So there is a long legal battle between members of the Finley family, particularly from New Zealand and Australia, New Zealand and Israel, and this woman and Catholic authorities. And every time there's a court order in the family's favor, all of a sudden the children are moved and they can't be located again. And again, there's more litigation. So for a period of some 8 years from the end of the war till 1953, when a French court finally orders that the children be handed over to their Israeli relatives, these children are being moved around France and part of Europe to prevent them from being handed over to their Jewish relatives. If you look, if you do a Google search, you will find a long, long article in Commentary magazine about this case in 1953. The article is about 25 pages in length. And of course, once they get shipped to Israel, you'd think that's the end of the story. The story comes back, it seems, every few years. But the next big event happens in this century. And there's a bunch of articles written about it again, in part because of the efforts of the Catholic Church to beatify Pope Pius XII, the Pope who reigned during the period of the Third Reich. And the efforts to beatify him are obviously confronted by a number of scholars who said, well, we need to go into the archives to see what action Pope Pius XII took to try to save Jews or assist Jews. And it's a huge controversy. We know about 10 years ago that the Vatican archives were open to scholars to look at the Pope's records. And then all of a sudden, quickly, those archives were closed. And they remain closed up until this past year. So there is that controversy, and obviously the Finley brother case plays a big part in all of this. What was the role of the Catholic Church in obstructing Jewish children from being reunited with family, whether it be parents or more distant relatives? The story gets some more energy, as I said, in the last year, because the archives are again opened by Pope Francis. And of course, what do they find? They find all kinds of documents that refer to the Catholic Church policy with respect to children who, Jewish children or other children who are baptized, and what should be done with them or not done with them in the way of handing them over to relatives, which would take them out of the Catholic faith. And that really has come to the fore in the last little while. Again, there are a number of academics who have written articles. There's a big article in the Atlantic magazine about discoveries made recently about documents in the papal archives. And so this case, as I said, goes on for about 8 years. The boys eventually are taken to Israel, and they obviously adapt fairly well. Their names are Robert and Gerald. Robert becomes an engineer in Israel, and Gerald becomes a doctor. They're obviously now well into their late 70s or 80s, but you can still find articles about them on the internet. It's an amazing story of the doggedness of the relatives to wage this 8-year legal battle to obtain custody of these 2 boys whose parents were murdered by the Nazi regime. Okay, so as I said earlier, yesterday, President Biden issued a number of new executive orders. He's issued a number of executive orders already dealing with the issue of immigration, trying to undo a lot of what the Trump administration had done. They have, for example, issued executive orders with respect to the people in the DACA program. They've continued protection for Liberians who had been given temporary protection in the United States because of unrest in their own country. But there obviously is this whole issue of these kids who were separated at the US-Mexican border from 2017 to some period in 2018, and probably actually after that. The worst tragedy was, although many of these kids were reunited with either their parents or relatives, we know that approximately 600 of these kids have not been reunited with their parents. And I want you to just think about the trauma suffered, as we know, from the children who survived the Holocaust. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that the kids separated at the US-Mexican border from their parents, sometimes forcibly, would also be suffering this kind of trauma. But I also want you to think about the parents. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have been parents of children. As a parent of young children a long time ago, I can only tell you that when you have those incidents in the mall or in the store or in a park where you lose sight of your children or child for just a few minutes and you go into terror as to what has happened to them, just imagine what these parents at the southern border have gone through, not knowing where their children were, not knowing how to get in touch with their children, not knowing how, if they would ever be reunited with their children. So the fact that Biden has passed an executive order dealing with these separated children in particular, I think is extremely important. I think it shows that the present administration is obviously very different than the previous administration and has a focus on humanity and empathy, which the previous administration in many ways did not have. So what does this policy, this new policy entail? Well, I'm just going to read a few parts of the order. So section 1 of the order, and this was just adopted yesterday or issued yesterday. Section 1 states policy. It is the policy of my administration to respect and value the integrity of families seeking to enter the United States. My administration condemns the human tragedy that occurred when our immigration laws were used to intentionally separate children from their parents or legal guardians, including through the use of zero tolerance policy. My administration will protect family unity and ensure that children entering the United States are not separated from their families, except in the most extreme circumstances where separation is clearly necessary for the safety and well-being of the child or is required by law. So that's the policy. And what are they proposing to do? Well, the first thing that's important to notice is that the main individuals on this task force are the following: the Secretary of Homeland Security, who's obviously involved in border protection, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who has responsibility for a lot of these children, and the Attorney General. Now, just to think back about what happened during the Trump administration, it was Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who promoted this policy, no doubt with the help and the urging of Stephen Miller. It was the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time who did not really stand up to the adoption of the zero tolerance policy, and nor did any of the other officials. And Health and Human Services, kept defending what they were doing and how the kids were being treated, despite the obvious images that we all could see on television. So the task force has a lot of heavy hitters. And just as an aside, two of those heavy hitters, the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Secretary of State, are both Jews who also have relatives who are Holocaust survivors. So I'm sure they have a keen understanding of the significance of the task before them. And what are they supposed to do? What's this task force supposed to do? So section 4 of the order deals with the functions. It says, one of the functions is identifying all children who were separated from their families at the United States-Mexico border between January 20, 2017 and January 2021. So it's not limited to the period when Trump said the zero tolerance policy had been rescinded, because there were still things that were going on that were similar to what was happening under the zero tolerance policy. It says in that period, in connection with the operation of the zero tolerance policy, to the greatest extent possible, facilitating and enabling the reunification of each of the identified children with their families by providing recommendations to heads of agencies to assist, recommendations regarding possible exercise of parole, because some of the parents would have been charged with illegal entry into the country as a criminal offense, as opposed to a simple civil offense as it had been up to the adoption of the zero tolerance policy, to make recommendations regarding the provision of additional services and support to the children and their families, including trauma and mental health services, and recommendations regarding unification of any additional family members of the children who were separated, such as siblings, where there is a compelling humanitarian interest to do so. The task force is required to provide regular reports to the president, including an initial progress report no later than 120 days after the date of this order, an interim progress report every 60 days thereafter, and a final report when their mission is completed. So just think of how different the Biden administration is dealing with this problem than the former Trump administration. They are, I would say they're being very mensch-like about this, and hopefully their efforts will come to fruition, and all of these children can be reunited with their parents or their families. So I am happy to take any questions that you have. Sure, I'm just going to play a video at the end, just to give you an idea of what the effects of reunification look like.
Perdóneme, hija, perdóneme. Gracias, Dios, por habérmela devuelto. Gracias. Está bien, amor. Ya sé con mami, ya no pasa nada. Gracias. La amo, mi amor. Usted sabe que la amo, ¿verdad? Sabe que me hacía falta. Le dije que usted era la mujer más hermosa del mundo. El regalo que Dios me dio. Nunca me voy a dejar sola otra vez. Oye, nunca. Perdóneme, cariño. Me dejó sola, perdóneme. No quería, pero... Déjame, gracias a Dios. Estoy contenta. Mire para allá. Ahí. Eso es para usted. Es tuya. Es suya, ¿no la quiere? Agárrela, es suya. Es para usted, mi amor.
I just want to remind you what Donald Trump said in the third debate, or really the second debate, because he didn't really appear for the second debate. When he was asked a question about zero tolerance, his answer was, well, the children are being well looked after. Well, even if that was true about their physical circumstances, we know, we all should know, that that was not true from an emotional perspective at all. You can see the kid not really responding to the mother, and I think that's partly her own trauma for having to deal with this, and obviously being brought together with her mother in this room with other people. So just keep that in mind. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eric. That video was quite moving. Did parents willfully, I guess, give up their children knowing that maybe they would have a better life in America and that they couldn't get in? Because the woman in the video said, I'm sorry for leaving you. Could you just clarify?
I don't know if in her case she was voluntarily leaving the child, or left her in the sense that she was obviously being taken in one place and the child was going in another direction. Initially, under the case law that existed at the time the zero tolerance policy was put in place, children were not to be detained for more than 20 days. And most families were kept intact. It was only after the zero tolerance policy was adopted that these separations occurred. Look, I'm sure there were parents of children who, probably older children than this child, who wanted their child to go to the United States. They would have a better life. At some point, the parent, I'm sure, would obviously hope to be reconnected with their child or children. But again, just think of those parents who took their children to the train stations in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia and put them on a train which would take their children to England for safety, not knowing if they would ever see them again, not knowing if they would survive. And the kids in the same position. Some of them too young to know, some of them old enough to understand at least a little bit. You know, there are cases of parents who grabbed their child out of the window of the train because they could not ultimately accept that they would be separated from their child.
I'd just like to remind everybody, if they have a question, you can put it in the chat. After this program finishes, we will be sending everyone an email with Eric's sources. In it, you'll see some upcoming Zoom events that might be of interest to you. One of them is being hosted by the United Nations. Lessons learned from children being separated during the Holocaust and how that can apply to, unfortunately, genocides that have happened today in children. So look for that. I do have one question here, Eric, and someone asks, what was the role of the Red Cross after World War II, and how did they help?
Well, I think they played a big role, but they were really part of an umbrella of organizations involved in trying to assist refugees. There was the United Nations Refugee and Rehabilitation Administration, for whom my mother for a short period of time worked in what we would call today a soup kitchen. She was lucky to get this job because it meant that at the end of the day, when the food was given out to those who wanted it, there would be food left over, which she could provide to her husband and at that point in time, a young child. The Red Cross was obviously involved in, particularly in the liberation of women at Ravensbrück. And that's a whole other story. There were 15,000 women, not all Jews, who the Red Cross in effect bargained with the Nazi regime to have released, and that they would be taken to Sweden, where they were. A friend of mine's mother was probably in one of those what are called white buses with a Red Cross, for the Red Cross, which traveled ultimately to Sweden. So they played a big role. They played a role in the creation of these records in the ITS, and they are still playing a role, I think, in trying to unify family in some way. They obviously weren't that good during the war. And
I have a couple more questions for you.
Yep.
I'm just going to read them here. Do you have any videos, I'm not sure if this is in your sources, of any Jewish family reunions, similar to what we just saw from the CNN?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I wasn't particularly looking for them. I've seen them on television when you see relatives who come to Toronto to be reunited. In Israel, the same thing. There are videos like that. They're not young children particularly. These are already adults, more long in the tooth than this young child. But obviously, the nature of video today is a lot different than what would have been in existence shortly after the war.
Here's another question. Of the records in Germany that are being digitized, are they being put into a database as data that can be searched, or are they being scanned into a database?
They are being put into a database that you can search. In fact, you can search some of the records already.
Yes, I actually went on to try and locate my family because we have a lost relative, but it's going to take some time. I'll report back if we find anything, but I went to the website and it was quite easy to use. Here's the last question. Were there laws enacted to carry zero tolerance policy where they turned into law? That is, was it legal? Or was the detention of the children illegal? Going back to the US.
I think if you look at the court cases that dealt with zero tolerance, at some point, obviously, the detention of these children was illegal. And although courts made orders against the US government, they are often not followed up. The US government was required to appear in court on many different occasions. The one thing that did happen that was different, and which was sort of at the basic purpose, or the basic force for the separation, was that people who entered the United States illegally, and I need to distinguish between asylum seekers and those who were not specifically seeking asylum. People who entered in the United States illegally, up until Jeff Sessions decided to enforce the criminal law, were basically treated with the breach as some kind of a civil wrong. And of course they could be deported, but they weren't treated as a criminal. When Jeff Sessions adopted zero tolerance, his position was anybody who entered the States illegally could be charged under this criminal statute, which obviously had much more serious ramifications. But the most important thing to understand is that everybody who came to a border crossing and specifically asked for asylum, and people who crossed the border illegally, but when first confronted, asked for asylum, did not enter the US government, the US, illegally, because there is a right to seek asylum. Now, you might ultimately be found not to be entitled to asylum, but that's a different question than whether you are illegal when you enter the country seeking asylum.
Right.
And that is a distinction that most people sort of just pass over.
This, I guess, leads us to a preview for next week. Could you let us know, I guess, give us a preview of what our session is next week? And it's something that, again, is very topical.
So we will be in the middle of the Trump impeachment number 2. So there might be things that I'm not aware of yet that might come to light. But the focus under this heading of recovery is not so much focused on COVID as how does the United States as a country recover from the presidency of Donald J. Trump. And what I'm going to focus on, for example, is there are probably lots of laws that Trump broke, including what happened with Ukraine. But equally important are all the norms that Trump broke. And by that, I mean all the agreed understandings about the role and power of a president. And to give you the obvious example, for many, many, many years, it was the position of the president and the US government that the president would not interfere in the administration of justice. That's not the president's purview. We know from the 4 years of Donald Trump that he crossed that line probably 20 or 30 or 50 times with help to his friends and supporters, to criticizing judges, to demanding that people be prosecuted. All of those things never happened before. at least not in my lifetime. So that's just an example of the kinds of things. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with correct or going back to the norms that have now been broken? So that's a big question.